When discussing the films of the 1970s, you cannot avoid the generational shift that characterized many of that decade's finest films. No film epitomizes this shift with as much haunting power as Joe. Released on July 15th, 1970, Joe was directed by John G. Avildsen, who would later go on to achieve great international acclaim with movies like Rocky and The Karate Kid. Judging from those career highlights, you might expect Joe to adhere to the same rah-rah underdog themes that he had so deftly mastered. But Joe inverts the notion of the underdog. Joe, played with an irresistible ferocity by Peter Boyle, is a working-class guy who sits at the bar and rails on the changing times, the hippies, people of color, a generation he characterizes as immoral and overly permissive. He finds an attentive ear when he befriends a wealthy advertising executive whose daughter is struggling with drug addiction. Both men form a pact to strike back against a society which is quickly outpacing them. Their journey ends in a devastating and shocking act of violence. The film became an underground hit, but not everyone in the audience was in on the joke. Joe was not designed to be an admirable character, but countless citizens who got lost in the culture gap identified all too fondly with his insensitive tirades. Copycat violence occurred in the aftermath of the film's release. A hit album contained Joe's most boisterous ravings. Horrified by the reaction, Boyle backed away from the audience's misinterpretation of his character. Nevertheless, his infectious performance left a lasting impact on society and future films and television series. You can draw a direct line from Joe to All in the Family to Taxi Driver. Critic Tony Macklin.
Joe was not the best of us. Mm-hmm. Joe was the mob. And the mob is the loudest voices in the room. And the people who pound the table and the people who get the attention. Joe's voice, Joe's voice, and I think that's one of the film is in some ways a satire of the persona of Joe, but Boyle is such a good actor that he humanizes it, and that's one reason why films so often are elevated, because it's on the script, you have the director who's creative, but the actors humanize the experience so that you can't just write this guy off as a caricature.
Director of John G. Avildsen, the king of the underdogs, Derek Wayne Johnson.
With Joe, one thing I admire about it is it's so ballsy. I mean, it's 1970. Here's a story about a guy who hates hippies, who hates everything that the 60s brought about. He's a quote-unquote hard hat. He's a guy that that works at a factory, and he's not a lovable guy, but I think that's kind of what makes him lovable. He's certainly the anti-hero. And it doesn't feel like a John Avildsen movie at all. And it's also John's first hit. It was the highest grossing independent film of 1970. So one thing I love about it is it's audacious. And it shows another side of John Avildsen that you didn't see in later years, this raw side about him. And of course, Peter Boyle is absolutely fascinating. His performance is up there with Marlon Brando. Actually, Martin Scorsese cites Pauline Kael in my documentary about how he was like a young Brando. And I think that's the highest compliment one can get. He's not imitating Brando. He just has that pizzazz. And it's just a fascinating piece of work. It in some places, Joe, I feel, is a little too much. But, it's a film that it couldn't be made today. I guarantee. It cannot be made today. However, it reflects so much of the times then and now. And also, I always like to point this out about Joe. Now, it was an independent movie. It wasn't a studio picture. But in 1969, you have Easy Rider. 1971, you have The French Connection. 1972, you have The Godfather, and so on and so on. 1970, for me, Joe stands out, and it's an underdog film. You may not look at it that way, but it kind of really is. And it's interesting how John was kind of doing this stuff. He was right in the mix of that 70s Renaissance.
In terms of the lead character, obviously he's a character filled with bitterness about the changing times and how he doesn't fit into them. But, I think people were, because it's such, like you said, an audacious character and very verbose, and I think he was kind of an infectious character for a lot of people. I know I even own the album of Joe Speaks, which is just of his monologues, ramblings. Was John troubled by the way the public seemed to take that lead character, to interpret that character?
I know that it was supposed to be a parody. Joe, in other words, Joe is not supposed to be a hero of the times. He's because John himself was a very liberal man, and I believe Peter Boyle was as well. So it's kind of a farce. It's a parody on that type of hard hat.
For a little perspective on what the Joe experience was like from the inside, we're pleased to present the following interview with actress K Callan. We interviewed Miss Callan last year for our Movie Geek Yearbook series. Joe represented the first feature film for Miss Callan, as she played the quietly suffering wife of the dominating lead character. In this conversation, we discuss many highlights of Miss Callan's career, including her book, How to Sell Yourself as an Actor, and her performances in The Onion Field, Lois and Clark, A Touch of Class, American Gigolo, Knives Out, and especially, of course, Joe. You have authored a series of books to help young artists kind of navigate their way into the industry. And I'm wondering, did you have a guide or a mentor yourself when you went off on this journey?
No, actually, I did not. But when I got to New York, I don't know how I knew to get this, but there was a book. And in those days, when I first went to New York, I had done commercials in Texas, where I came from. And so I felt more at home trying to do something like that. And there was a book called the Madison Avenue Handbook that listed all the casting directors, et cetera, so, which I found very helpful. But then the reason I wrote the book was that when my ship came in, when I had some choices, up until that time, nobody really wanted to be my agent. I mean, I had freelance agents for commercials, but for theatrical, which is harder to get into. But when I did the film Joe, I got the New York Times reviews, and while it didn't make me a star, but it put me in the system. And so then there were a lot of agents who wanted me, but I had no idea how you choose. And at that time, I still didn't really choose. I got a manager to avoid making that choice, which was not the best choice, but it was what I could imagine doing at the time. And so then later, much later, when I was out in Los Angeles, my son was getting a PhD, my daughters were writing and producing their own music, putting out records, and I thought, well, I have always wanted to know, if every agent in the world wanted you, how would you make a decision? And I'm just going to write a book about that. I'm going to interview agents, and I'm going to ask all the questions that as an actor you're really afraid to ask. And so I wrote the first book. And then the first book, which was really for actors, when that came out, then the writers got in touch with me, and they're like, where's our book? And then the directors were like, where's our book? And then Samuel French was distributing for me, and they wanted a book that could be sold all over the world. And that's when I wrote How to Sell Yourself as an Actor. So that's how all that came to be.
So when you, probably having dealt with managers and agencies your entire career, when you finally sat down and grilled them for these books, what were the main questions that you thought, oh gosh, why didn't I know to ask this when I was starting out?
Well, mainly I think when you're starting out, you're afraid to ask an agent or a manager anything. You're just so excited that, that they're talking to you. And so mostly you just say, will you sign me? But however, that's an interesting question because right after Joe came out, there was a casting director, Jay Wolf, who's now passed on, but he had me in for something, and he said, Kay, it doesn't look good that you're not signed to an agency. I was freelancing at that point, which you could do in New York in those days. He said, it doesn't look good. You should get an agent. And I'm like, well, I don't know how to choose. I mean, really. And he said, well, I have this friend who, maybe you can go see him, and he'll give you some advice. So this guy was he was at William Morris, and he was like one of the God agents, which I was too green to even know about. But when I went in and I talked to him, I was like, oh, I want you. And he said, well, no, he said, it's a group decision here, so, I would have to talk to everyone else here. And then when I went back 2 weeks later to see if they wanted me, he said, you're too old for us at your place in the universe. You should, Eileen Heckert had just been, and she was probably 40-something. I was like 32, but she had just been nominated for an Academy Award for Butterflies Are Free, and he said, you'd have to be as far along as Eileen Heckert. And I'm like, oh, okay. And so I really didn't understand how it works, how the whole system works, how the business works, et cetera, et cetera. And so anyway, it was many years later. At the time, because when I worked with the manager, there was a wonderful agent, Jeff Hunter, who had been working with me freelance. I don't know whether he had asked me to sign or not. But anyway, I had been working with him, and ultimately I signed with him. So I really lucked into a wonderful agent, and he put me in touch with a wonderful agent out here. But I still wanted to know, because as an actor who doesn't know much about the business, you just know about the agents that your friends have, and then the big agencies like WME or ICM Partners or something that wouldn't be interested in you, but there's a lot of smaller boutique agents who have big clients who would have great access, but you don't have any way of knowing about that. So that was what I did, and it was, even though, I'd been in the business many years by that time, 7 or 8, I think, it was still, nerve-wracking to call an agent, because maybe they knew me and maybe they didn't, and maybe they'd talk to me and maybe they wouldn't. And also, they don't really need any more actors getting in touch with them to say, please be my agent, and my book's just going to open the door for a lot of that. So It was always scary, but always interesting. I'm really interested in people's journeys. How did you get from here to there? How did you know to call that person, et cetera?
Yeah, exactly. And you have done throughout your career quite a lot of TV and some of the greatest shows in television history. And I want to talk about the big one, Lois and Clark, in a little bit. But what I'm curious about, when you go in and out of different television sets, and you're doing maybe 1 or 2 episodes, and you're entering an already established family, and you're kind of the outsider. I mean, do you feel like the outsider, and how do you overcome that?
Are you in the business yourself, Jamie? How do you know to ask that question? That's such a great question.
I love acting. I'm not in the business outside of doing the show, but I just love the craft of it.
See, I don't think anybody else would ever even think to ask or even realize that you are going onto a set with like 50 or 100 people who all know each other, have relationships, you're the new person, and you've got to have enough chutzpah to go in there and act like you belong with them. And that's a big deal.
I think so too. And with some of the directors that I've spoken to that go in and out of different TV shows, I mean, I think it's equally daunting, because they have to catch up to what the show is, what the spirit of the show is, and then determine, what can I bring to this enterprise that is uniquely my own, while still maintaining the spirit of what I'm doing, what the show is. Is that
right?
A similar,
and how
similar
do you?
process?
So if you're coming in and there's big stars on the show, are they going to even listen to anything that I have to say?
Yeah.
I think that would be really. I think about that a lot. I recently did a film that's coming out Thanksgiving, and Ryan Johnson is the director, and we were talking about it, and he was when we were talking about it, and I was just meeting with him, I didn't know that I was going to be cast or not, but he was just getting ready to, and I talked to him about that, and I said, and it must be really hard for you too, although he's a very big deal. You know, he had 4 wonderful movies before he directed the Star Wars movie, but imagine being the director and coming into a Star Wars movie. I mean, I can't even imagine. I think, you know, they must say the rosary every day.
Yeah. Well, Knives Out looks phenomenal. I can't wait to see that.
It's a really fun movie. I think you'll like it.
Yeah, I'm sure I will. Okay, so you had some early credits in TV, and I'm wondering, how did Joe come into your life?
Well, Joe was, when I was in New York, it was like maybe my 3rd year. And it was an agency that sent me out for commercials. But I think for Joe, every agent in town sent out, you know, everybody in town, it was an independent film. Every agency in town, I think, sent in every picture of anybody who was at all the right size, age, and color. And so, actually, I went in one day when I had, I don't know, whatever the call was, 11 or whenever the appointment was, and there were just wall-to-wall people all over the floor. There were so many people there. And I'm like, well, I couldn't wait all day for this. You know, I had 3 kids to support by myself, and I had other things to do, and so I just left. And I came back at the end of the day when there were just like a couple of people there. And I auditioned for John Avildsen, and we did kind of an improv, and that's how I ended up getting the job. But more interesting than that is that originally Lawrence Tierney was supposed to play the part that Peter Boyle had. Oh. And Lawrence Tierney, I don't know whether you know, I believe he was Dana Andrews' brother. And I guess he'd had a long career. And however they got him for this independent film that was paying like 35 cents, I don't know. But they took him to Alexander's department store, which was across from Bloomingdale's in those days, to buy him wardrobe. And on the escalator, he exposed himself. And so they said, oh, my God, we have to get rid of this. So they got rid of him and whoever his wife was supposed to be. Then they cast Peter, and then I was the wife that, you know, worked out with Peter.
That's quite an unexpected story.
Well, and the other thing is that I had never done a film. I was very, very green, and I looked at the material, which to me looked like a couple of 60-second commercials. I didn't understand that you have a scene here and a scene there. They cut it through the film, and then you have a presence in the film. And I did it, and then I kind of forgot about it. And this was in the days when there were phone booths, and you checked in with your service, you know, every hour or so. And I had this message from a guy I never heard of, and I called him up, and he was the publicist for what had become Joe. And he said, do you want to hear your rave reviews from Judith Christ? And I'm like, well, what for? And he said, for Joe. And I'm like, what's that? It had originally been called The Gap because it was the gap, I guess, in those 2 relationships, or else it was between the daughter and the father. I don't know what their original intent was. But anyway, I was like, sure. And he read it to me, and he said, you haven't seen the film. I said, no. He said, oh, well, you should come see the film. And so I did. And so it just became this wonderful gift from the gods. You know, the film was on many 10 best lists, and right after it came out, Kent State happened, which mirrored some of the things that happened in the film, which was like when 3 Mile Island happened after whatever that other film was. You know, it gave it a lot more context.
Yeah. And I think when I rewatched it recently, I mean, it really accentuates that generational gap. I mean, if you mention a gap.
That's what it was, a generation gap, yeah.
And what I'm curious about with that film is how people read the film. I think a lot of people might have misinterpreted it at the time and kind of heroicized Joe. I even have a record in my LP collection that Joe Speaks, which is just a record of all of his racist tirades. and I'm wondering, were you aware of that people might not have gotten the actual message of that film right?
I wasn't, but, you know, that's exactly what All in the Family was about. You know, people who were conservative thought that he was a hero, and people that were liberal thought of it the other way, but thought it was funny and thought of Meathead as the hero. This is what the audience brings to something. I really didn't realize that at the time, but it totally doesn't surprise me.
And how did you feel about her, about your character in that film?
That was the woman I was raised to be. I knew just how to do that. You're subservient to your husband. You do what he says. You don't have a mind of your own. That was who Mary Lou was.
Was everything scripted, or you said that there was?
Except for Peter. Peter's the one who really made the film. It was Peter's first film, but I think he came out of Second City and was a big improviser. And the character of Joe, as he played it, as I understand it, was a character that he had kind of played when they did improv. And so he just brought that to it, and he added a lot to it, and that's why ultimately, evidently when they cut the first film together, everybody came out with their head in their hands and was like, "Oh my God, what are we going to do with this?" And they took it back in, and Charles Norris, I can't remember his name, but the editor recut it, and he recut it because I think John Avildsen had cut it before, and he was also the cinematographer, so he was a little gratuitous in his shots. And so when the second editor came in and cut it, then they had this film. And then the film was Joe. And it was the relationship between the hard hat and the advertising man. And that's what the film became. The emphasis was supposed to be on the father-daughter relationship.
And what kind of an acting partner was Peter Boyle for you?
Oh, he was great. He was just the best. He was I really loved Peter. I didn't know him before that. We'd see each other on the street in New York from time to time after that. And I never did get to see him out here when he was doing Raymond and having that great success, which I was very happy for him. But, he had a lovely career all along.
And you mentioned that when you did Joe, your first film, that you felt very green. Was there a film where you felt like you found your groove and you're like, okay, I get this process now. I'm more comfortable and settled into this?
Oh, I don't think I felt green at the time. I know now how green I was just period when I was in New York.
Yeah.
Thank goodness I thought I knew a lot more than I did. If I had any consciousness of where I was on the food chart, to where everything was. I didn't get to New York till I was 32. I was from Texas. I had taught school. I married. I divorced. And when I got divorced, it was like, well, I'm not going to stay in Norman, Oklahoma, where I was living at that point, for my husband to get an advanced degree. And it's like, I don't want to go back to Dallas. I'm just going to go do what I was going to go do in the first place. So I took the kids and went to New York and was extremely lucky. But because you're young and stupid, it doesn't occur to you that anything can go wrong. But I thought, because I had done all these commercials, and I had also, when I was teaching, I had directed and produced plays and stuff, so I felt like I was a lot further along the line than I was. And when I went to New York, I never felt, like I don't know as much as the next person. I actually didn't even know half as much as the next person. It's only in retrospect that I know how very green I was. After I was out here a few years, way into my career, I ran into a casting director from Ted Bates who had cast me in commercials. I was at the theater one night, and Raleigh came up and she said, "Hi, Kay, it's Raleigh Bester." And I'm like, "Oh, I'm so happy to see you. Thank you for saying hello." She said, "I knew you when you weren't even very good." And I just laughed because it was hilarious and it was true. I look back on stuff from that time. It's like, or you look back on anybody's stuff from when they were young. They were just becoming. You have to spend a certain amount of time. And mostly for me at 32 in New York, I was in competition with other 32-year-olds who had been there for 10 years. But I luckily didn't really understand my shortcomings, or otherwise I'm sure I would have run back home.
Well, I want to ask you about a couple of these other films, and I'll name some titles. If you could just tell me the most kind of vivid memories that come to mind in association with these titles.
Okay.
A Touch of Class. Oh,
that was so great. I love, that's when I went to Spain. My fantasy had been, I'm going to travel. I'm going to go all these places. This is the only fabulous place I ever went in a job. But I got to go to Spain, and I became friends with Glenda Jackson, who at the time was already a big star. But again, back to my greenness, I really didn't know that. And George Seal was a big star. I didn't know, because I hadn't been in New York that long, that he'd been on Broadway in Virginia Woolf, and that he was a big star, and she was a big star. My manager at the time told me before I left that I should go see Glenda. Women in Love was playing, and I should see that before I left, but it didn't mean anything to me. So I was able to be a regular person with her. But then when I got back home, because I had met her and we had worked together, I saw her Elizabeth series that was on PBS, which was just breathtaking. And I remember writing her saying, oh, my God, I'm so happy that I didn't see that beforehand, or I would never have been able to treat you like a regular person. And anyway, Glenda and I are still friends to this day. I saw her last year in New York when she did Lear, and then the year before that when she did Three Tall Women.
What an incredibly powerful actress she is.
Oh,
Wow.
and person. She's so strong, and she's a member of Parliament for all those years. She's the most amazing person to talk to on a great variety of subjects.
And you did a part in The Onion Field, Harold Becker's film, didn't you?
Yes, I did. I played James Wood's mother. And James and I knew from New York, we had done a commercial together, actually right after Joe came out. And I had all these wonderful reviews. And we were in, Baltimore or someplace. I'm doing this regional commercial. And I had to play this woman who had forgotten to make a bank deposit and had parachuted out of a plane to get there. And so I had this parachute on, and then they would pick me up, from by the parachute and hold me high in the air so that they could drop me down so that it was though I just landed, I remember turning to James and brushing myself off and saying, I was just in a film. They don't know that, or they wouldn't throw me in the street like that. It's just a joke, of course. But anyway, so I did a couple of things with James Woods. I can't remember the other one, but I know it was also Hal Becker.
Oh, yeah, okay. I think they worked together again in The Boost. I'm not sure what other film they did together.
That may have been it. I remember I just played a motel operator or something like that. But I just remember that it was nice to see Jimmy again.
Yeah. And American Gigolo, we've had Mr. Schrader on our show several times, and this movie was it's one of those quintessential movies of that time period. So what was your experience like on the set of that?
Well, of course, all my scenes were with Richard, which was lovely. And I just had a wonderful time, and I remember that Schrader treated me as well above my pay station, I thought. He was so gracious to me. I have fond memories of him and of Richard. That was a very nice experience.
Do you have any problems watching yourself? Like when you went to the theater and you saw yourself in American Gigolo or any of these films, are you self-conscious at all about it, or are you okay with it?
No, I don't understand all these actors. Are they lying who say, I never watched myself? I watch myself to see if I did well. I like to see myself before other people see it, because if I did well, I'll say, oh, yeah, you should see that. And otherwise, I just won't even mention it. I like to look and see how it happens. And it always is kind of an otherworldly experience. It's hard for me to really associate that is me. But I am there, grading myself on what I did or how I looked or whatever.
Well, I watched you in something just last night, and I liked it very much. It was something I hadn't seen before, called Midnight Clear.
Oh yes, that was a wonderful experience. We made that first as a half-hour film for Dallas to raise money for the film, and then we went back and he had expanded it, and we did the whole thing. Thank you very much. That was a good experience.
I liked it very much, yeah. And I guess when we talk about your career, one of the big projects that you're best known for is Lois and Clark, where you did something like 87 episodes.
Oh, no, I didn't do that many. I think Lois and Clark did that many. I did let's see, my contract was 7 out of 13, and we did 4 years. I don't think I did 87, did I? It seems like I did more on the series I did for Tyler Perry. What was that called? Meet the Browns. But I don't know, maybe I did. But anyway, yes, it was a wonderful experience. It was nice to have a regular job, and more when people come up to me and they're like, oh, I know you. Oh, but what do I know you from? I've learned now to just say, here's my real name. Look it up on IMDb, because I'm going to say this and you're going to say no, and then I'm going to say that and you're going to say no, and pretty soon I'm going to feel like I never worked and you're going to be embarrassed. But if I'm going to say anything, I usually say Lois and Clark, because, that gave me more visibility than anything else.
Well, and it's odd because I think as an actor you can do a ton of noteworthy movies, but if you are on a hit TV series, there's a different level of familiarity that people have with you, where they almost feel more comfortable with you, like you're part of their family or inner group somehow.
Well, I think what happens is because you're in somebody's living room. For instance, when I first moved out here, the first show I worked on was One Day at a Time, and right next door was All in the Family, which was such an iconic show and had been on for several years. And I remember that we were having a read around the table, and Carol came in to pick up something off the table, and it was all I could do to keep myself from saying, hi, how are you, because I felt like I knew him. Then ultimately I worked on that show. But I mean, I just think when somebody's in your living room and you see them over and over, you just feel like, in the same way that they say that when you see a film, that your consciousness experiences it as though it's the truth. So if it's violence and whatever, your body's gone through all those things, whatever. And so I think when you see somebody in your living room all that time, you really think they were in your living room on some level.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Is there a film in your resume that you feel is undervalued, that you wish more people had seen?
Oh, I don't think so. Not that I can think of. I feel like anything I was in got about the amount of worthy reception it should get.
And you have Knives Out that will be released this upcoming season.
Yes, day before Thanksgiving.
Yeah, and I cannot wait to see that. Is there anything else in the pipeline for you?
Well, not at the moment that I know about, but that's what keeps all of us in the business is, the phone could ring at any minute. And, I mean, that's how Knives Out happened. Actually, I was on vacation with my daughter. We had just left Los Angeles. We had gotten into New York. We changed planes. We got to Rome. And there, you have internet for the first time, and there's an email from this person I never heard of saying, hi, I am so-and-so. I'm the producer for Rian Johnson, and I really didn't know who he was then. And for your consideration, confidential. And it was the script. And I was like, I emailed back right then, and I said, well, I'm in Rome. I'm on my way to Palermo. I'll read it, when I get to Palermo. And actually, the first thing he sent me were really revisions, and it was just a few pages. So I remember saying to my daughter, this had happened. I said, but look, it's just probably a short film or something. I don't know what it is. And I kind of forgot about it. And so then I got to Palermo, and we had a whole day of stuff. So it was like 9:30 at night. And I tried to read it, but by this time I'd been up 24 hours, and I read, a few pages of it, and then I just went to sleep. And then what I thought was morning, but was really only an hour later, I got either a call or a text, I'm not sure, from one of the casting people saying, blah, 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 and she's a casting director that I know, and a casting assistant. And she said, Rian Johnson wants to FaceTime with you tomorrow about this. And I'm like, well, I haven't read very much of it, but I only had one line. And she said, well, you'll see, keep going. And so anyway, it was this amazing, wonderful gift from the gods. Actually, as it turns out, they brought me home early from my vacation because they wanted to have, hair and makeup tests because they had to do a lot of age work on me. and so forth. But I was off, in Europe, and then oh boy, look at this wonderful job. Actually, all actors say that all you have to do to get a job is book a non-refundable airline ticket. But I actually had 3. Because I had that one, and then when we got back, I was supposed to go the next week to a high school reunion, and then I had already bought a ticket to go to my son's for Thanksgiving. And so now I know the secret thing to do is to get 3 non-refundable airline tickets to get another job.